Welcome to Personal Democracies Forum's symposium on Wikileaks and Internet freedom. My name is Andrew Richet. I'll be acting as your MC for this morning and also for part of the proceedings. I have a couple quick announcements to make. One is please turn your cell phones off, at least the ringers off. Those of you who are tweeting, I'm sure my announcement's not going to make any difference to you. We're going to have as much audience participation as possible. We've handed out programs, so for those of you who have something to say or something to speak, want to speak, we'll make time. But we're going to ask people to, we're going to be very strict about making sure that people are concise, to the point, and are civil. As a matter of fact, on that issue, this is not actually a completely free speech auditorium. We're expecting everyone to be respectful of each other and respectful of each other's points of view, and anybody who doesn't behave that way will no longer be our guest. I'd also like to remind everybody that the hashtag for today's event is PDFLeaks, PDFLeaks. We're also streaming this live at www.personaldemocracy.com/PDFLeaks live. There's no smoking on the plaza. In fact, there's no smoking anywhere around this building. If you want to smoke, you'll have to go out to First Avenue. And without further ado, we're going to start our first panel. And thank you, everybody, for coming. And I hope you have a nice time.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, leave that here. Hi, I'm Micha Sifri, co-founder of Personal Democracy Forum. Welcome, everybody. As Andrew said, we're going to be trying to pack a lot in the next 4 hours. So I'm going to keep introductions to an absolute minimum. I just want to tell you about the format for how we're going to proceed. We were able to get on extremely short notice an amazing array of people and smart, engaged, involved in the internet, involved in politics, technology, in some cases the worlds of diplomacy, journalism, and we really worked hard to get a wide range of perspectives. At the same time, I don't want you to draw any conclusions from the people who are here or who are not here. There were people who we wanted to get who were simply not available, and we're very appreciative of the people who are all willing to take the time. We've asked everybody to keep their remarks to 7 minutes, which is a violation of my own rule about panels, never to have a panel this big and never to make people talk so short, and they've all agreed to do that. So we're going to have a first panel followed by about 45 minutes of open forum, which our good friend Jeff Jarvis, playing his best Oprah Donahue, will run around and try and bring everybody in as best as we can, because we really have a lot of great people in the audience with important things on their minds too. This is meant to be a conversation starter. We're not trying to hammer out a manifesto. We're not asking everybody here to agree to a common position, but just hopefully we can all think together about what we all, I think, agree is a hinge moment for all kinds of issues that are raised by WikiLeaks. The 4 topics we asked people to really address from the beginning were: in the digital age, should all information be free? Does good government require secrecy or more openness? Can we trust private internet service providers to defend free speech? And what is WikiLeaks? A terrorist organization, the beginning of some kind of new transnational investigative journalism, or maybe something in between? We're going to start with 2 speakers who are joining us virtually, and we're going to give them a little benefit for connecting to us from different parts of the world. The first one coming up is Mark Pesce, who is an author, futurist, and digital anthropologist who many of you may remember from his appearances at PDF in previous years. Coming to us from Australia, Mark Pesce. Kick us off.
Getting from Australia, the nation that has nurtured Julian Assange, a nation whose political leaders have been falling over each other in their eagerness to hand him over to the American government. If only he were here. It's a bit embarrassing, and it perfectly illustrates Australia's perpetual role as a toadying junior power. For the past 300 years, the relationship between the press and the state has been straightforward. press tries to publish, and the state uses its various mechanisms to thwart those efforts. This has produced a cat-and-mouse steady state, a balance, where selection pressures kept the press tamed and the state, in many circumstances, somewhat accountable to the governed. There are, as always, exceptions. In the last few months, the press has become hyper-connected, using that hyperconnectivity to pierce the veil of secrecy which surrounds the state, using the means available to it to hyper-distribute those secrets. The press has become hyper-empowered, an actor unlike anything ever experienced before. Wikileaks is the press, but not the press as we have known it. It's the press of the 21st century, the press that comes after we are all connected. Suddenly, all of the friendliest computers have become the deadliest weapons, and we are fenced in, encircled by threats, which are also opportunities. This threat is two-sided, Janus-faced. The state finds its ability to maintain the smooth functioning of power short-circuited by the exposure of its secrets. That is a fundamental existential threat. In the same moment, the press recognizes that its ability to act has been constrained at every point. Servers get shut down, domain names fail to resolve, bank accounts freeze. These are the new selection pressures on both sides, a sudden quickening of culture's two-step, and of course, it does not end there. The state has now realized the full cost of digitization, the price of bits. Just as the recording industry learned a decade ago, it will now have to function within an ecology which, like it or not, has an absolutely fluid quality. Information flow is corrosive to institutions, whether that's a record label or a ministry of state. To function in a hyper-connected world, states must hyper-connect. But every point of connection becomes a gap through which the state's power leaks away. Meanwhile, the press has come up against the ugly reality of its own vulnerability. It finds itself situated within an entirely commercial ecology, all the way down to the wires used to carry its signals. If there's anything that the last week has taught us, it's that the ability of the press to act must never be contingent upon the power of the state or any organization dependent upon the good graces of the state. Both sides are trapped, each with a knife drawn at the other's throat. So is there any way to back down from this DEFCON 1-like threat level? The new press cannot be wished out of existence, even if the internet disappeared tomorrow. What we have already learned about how to communicate with one another would never be forgotten. It's that shared social learning which presents the continued existential threat to the state. The state is now furiously trying to develop a response in kind, with a growing awareness that any response which extends its own connectivity must necessarily drain it of power. There is already a movement underway within the state to shut down the holes, to close the gaps, and carry on as before. But to the degree that the state disconnects, it drifts away from synchronization with the real world. The only tenable possibility is a forward escape, an embrace of that which seems destined to destroy it. This new form of state power, hyper-democracy, it will be diffuse, decentralized, and ubiquitous. Darknet as a model for governance. In the interim, the press must reinvent its technological base as comprehensively as Gutenberg or Berners-Lee. Just as the legal strangulation of Napster laid the groundwork for Nutella, every point of failure revealed in the state attack against Wikileaks creates a blueprint for the press which can succeed where Wikileaks failed. We need networks that lie outside of, and perhaps even in opposition to commercial interest, beyond the reach of the state. We need resilient internet services which cannot be arbitrarily revoked. We need a transaction system that is invisible, instantaneous, and convertible upon demand. Our freedom requires this. Now, some will argue that these represent the perfect toolkit for terrorism, for lawlessness, and anarchy. Some are willing to sacrifice liberty for security, ending with neither. Now, although nostalgic and tempting, This argument will not hold against the tenor of these times. These systems will be invented and will be hyper-distributed, even if the state attempts to enforce tighter grips on its networks. Julian Assange, the most famous man in the world, has become the poster boy, the shade for the network generation. Script kiddies everywhere now have a role model. Like it or not, they will create these systems. They will share what they've learned. They will build the apparatus that makes the state, as we have noted, increasingly ineffectual and irrelevant. Nothing can be done about that. That has already happened. We face a choice. This is a fork in both the old and new senses of the word. The culture we grew up with has suddenly shown its age, its incapacity, its inflexibility. That's scary because there is nothing yet to replace it. That job is being left to us. We can see what is broken and how it should be fixed. We can build new systems of human relations which depend not on secrecy but on connectivity. We can share knowledge to develop the blueprint for a hyper-connected, hyper-empowered future. Now, a week ago, such an act would have been bootless utopianism. Today, it's facing facts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And now joining us from California, a woman who I think could be called the godmother of the internet, Esther Dyson. Esther, are you there?
Yes, I am. Godmother, Queen Mary, whatever. What I'd like to do, I'm sitting here talking to you without seeing you, and my favorite mode of engagement is actually to engage real time, not simply to deliver a talk. So I'm trying to think how to be most useful. What I'd like to do is incorporate by reference not just what Mark Pesce said, but what everybody has already said. It seems to me we're coming in not at the beginning. There's been a huge amount already said. And here at this conference, I'm concerned that it's too much the we that Mark refers to and not enough of the rest of the world. For a lot of people, Julian Assange is not the most famous person in the world. They barely notice this. Life continues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm also concerned that we're not really listening to people outside of this room. I wish there were some more of the establishment on the panel to argue with us. So I'm going to, at some point, try to channel them a bit. I'd also like, so what I'm going to do is not deliver a talk, but make just 3 or 4 points. First of all, to the extent that there is a we, I think we need to condemn people like Anonymous. And, you know, we believe in transparency and freedom of speech. We don't believe in shutting people down, even if they're people we disagree with. And to have any moral credibility at all, the voices of transparency also need to condemn. It's like kids, they see a bonfire and suddenly little boys start throwing firecrackers everywhere because they think everything is now permitted. So that's one point. The second is, ironically, there hasn't, probably the most interesting, useful leaks recently have in fact been Abu Ghraib, not through WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is an interesting implementation of a broader phenomenon. And there are really 2 parts to it. There are the people who leak, and what they're doing is illegal. That doesn't mean it's wrong. Often it's right. What we need is that
Disconnection right here.
there's.
Sorry, Esther, 1 second.
Yeah. Are you throwing my computer around or what?
No, it's just bad connectivity right here. You're there, Esther.
It's
1
his
second.
wire. Yeah.
Speak to us.
Same thing happened at Woodstock.
I literally just put. Just talk, Esther.
Get her to talk and then you can adjust it.
I'm just hearing this horrible background. Okay. revealed has been...
Hold on.
Yeah, okay.
It's that connection. Apologies.
Yeah.
Sure as anything.
Okay.
Is she there?
Esther, give us a test.
Okay. I'm testing.
Just keep talking.
Yeah.
Count to 20.
What if you just
Are you hearing the same thing I'm hearing?
Good.
There.
Okay, now we got it.
Okay,
No,
wonderful.
it's not.
So it's worth making the distinction between the leakers who are in most cases doing something illegal, from violating terms of service to violating a holy contract with the U.S. government or their diplomats or something like that. And in fact, they can be gone after legally. Many of those people, especially in countries with evil regimes, are heroes, and the laws with which they are gone after, I think, are the wrong laws. But then there's Wikileaks, which tries to operate outside that and simply produces stuff that was sent to it. So the questions to ask about those two things are different. But one thing is clear: the world does need heroes who are willing to break the law, willing to do bad things, but then it also needs so-called accountable people like the press who decide it's going to harm somebody or whatever. And there's an ecosystem that keeps interacting. It's not, things are not always good or always bad, and that's why the world is much more complicated. So, okay, Mark says, anyway, it's clear, as Mika has and many people have said, the U.S. government, other governments, are way overreacting to something really minor. I think it's because they're terrified of what might come next. So far, nothing's been that damaging, and from my point of view, I think this transparency is useful. They are overreacting. They should be told that. I hope our laws will serve to check WikiLeaks and things like that. The challenge is going to be later when so-called really bad stuff is revealed. The government, rather than go after WikiLeaks, needs to learn how to keep those secrets more secret instead of having this huge diplomatic, basically open channel. They need to become less controlling of stuff that's not dangerous, more controlling of stuff that is. Will that happen? I'm not sure. But that's the response that I think responsible people should encourage, that the government itself keep its important, genuine secrets, and there should be very few of them, secret more effectively, and then relax about WikiLeaks. I don't think that's going to happen, but I do think it's important not to go over the top. Not all governments are evil. Governments are, in fact, supposed to represent us. Many times they don't, and WikiLeaks is a good counterforce to that. Let me stop here. The communication channel is not ideal, but I reserve the right to raise my hand later and comment on what other people say.
Great. Thank you, Esther. I'll be watching in the chat here, and if you have to raise your hand, hopefully I will not mess up the connection the next time you try to speak. Thank you very much. Okay.
Touch anything.
Don't touch. Here, take this mic.
Should I use the handheld?
Yeah, Next up, Jeff Jarvis, who teaches at the CUNY Journalism School and writes Buzz Machine, the blog. Jeff.
I first want to start off by thanking Mika and Andrew and PDF for holding this event, and all of you for coming on such short notice, which is a testament to how important this is and how we can't let the the agenda be set elsewhere on this. And I also want to note the metaphorical warning to us of a single plug being a single point of failure in communication in the world. I like Mika's phrase that we're at a hinge moment, and I believe that we're at a hinge moment on an ethic of transparency and publicness and openness in our world. And as always at these moments, there is a countervailing pressure. I'm working on a book called Public Parts, yes, an homage to Howard, the title at least. And in my research, I found that fear about privacy and shutting down comes with every new technology and the change that it results. There was not a discussion of a legal right to privacy in this country until 1890, and the cause was the Kodak camera and the penny press. And again and again and again, new technologies cause change and cause fear and cause a clampdown. And in essence, I believe that's what's happening with Wikileaks. And it's blamed on Assange, it's blamed on the internet, it's blamed on Wikileaks, but I think we have to get the discussion far past Wikileaks. As Esther said, it's just one episode here, and there are other leaks that go on. I do believe we are at a huge change in society, and of course we say that a lot these days, we internet triumphalists, of which I'm a proud member. But I think we're there, and there are some Danish academics at the University of Southern Denmark who talk about the Gutenberg parenthesis, and we're coming out on the other end, I think, of a more process-oriented world. We're moving from, pardon the alliteration, a world structured on power to power to a world structured on peer to peer. And that is ultimately disruptive to any power structure. The power structures will fight back. As Esther said, we also need people in power structures who are responsible and accountable. There will still be that power, but it changes our structure, and disruption causes fear and causes regression then. This is just one outbreak we're going through now of a loss of control, a passing of control. And you can call it, those in control will see it as anarchy, the rest of us will see it as victory, and that's the essence of the battle and fight we're going to be under. In the current situation, I think that the problem we have, I'm very disappointed in the reaction of our government, of course, to this, that what I hoped would be a response and a reflex of transparency is, of course, the exact opposite. It's a reflex of shutting down information, of trying to find more security, more secrecy. The problem is that government is secret by default. That's what WikiLeaks really exposes. Government must be transparent and open and public by default and secret by necessity. We still do need secrets. I don't disagree with that for matters of security, criminal investigation, citizens' privacy, and sometimes diplomacy. But we need to move to a default of transparency. That is the default of our world, I think. And companies are next in this. Companies will come next in this, and they're learning that today. You know, whether it's Best Buy and Twitter or anywhere else, they're learning that this is where the world is going. The press must gather around to defend WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is the press. It does the role of the press. If we do anything less, then we risk terrible precedents being set. And that is my concern about our world today, is the precedents that we can set. In Germany, I'm amused but also disturbed that people are having their homes pixelated on Street View out of a sense of privacy. They call it a Verpixelungsrecht, a right to be pixelated. What Amazon did in cutting off WikiLeaks, then does the printer of the New York Times do the same? We set precedents. The fact that I can go to MasterCard and I can contribute to the Ku Klux Klan using my MasterCard or Visa card, but I now cannot contribute to WikiLeaks and defense of freedom of speech and transparency in our world. The fact that DNS becomes a single point of failure, witness the plug, is a danger for us. The fact that there are services in Libya using the .ly of Libya, and they're dangerous, that's a problem. And of course, China and Google and the US, which I'm sure we'll hear more about from Rebecca. I want to just say one more thing here, which is that I think that what we need, we should blame ourselves for much of this. But we can have a start today. And Mika said we're not going to come out of here with an agreement, and that's fine, but I would like us to come out of here with a discussion about a set of principles. Because the problem when these things happen is we have nothing to point to, no flag in the ground to say, you're violating this. Well, what's this? What's the violation? Where's the principle? We, the people of the internet, the eighth continent, as the CTO of the Veterans Administration calls it, must set those principles. Now, I've had the hubris to put up a set of principles online, and I'm inspired by the Reverend Leon Sullivan, who set the Sullivan Principles against apartheid in 1977. It was those principles that gave a flag to point to say, that's wrong. We think that's wrong. And it was independent. And of course, those principles live on today for corporate responsibility. And so we need some set of principles so that if you look at China, Google enforced its principles in finally a good way, I think, in China. We can disagree about that another day. But then they turned around and did a deal with Verizon, splitting up the Sudetenland with none of us at the table. So as much as I'm a Google fanboy, I wrote the book, I don't want Google to be the one to defend the principles of the internet. Neither does Google want to be in that position. We must be. So I had the hubris to put up a third revision of a Bill of Rights. I'll read this to you really quickly. It's very short. I'm wrong in many of these points, but what I want is discussion about this. So here are my suggestions. 1, we have the right to connect. 2, we have the right to speak freely. 3, we have the right to assemble and act. 4, information should be public by default, secret by necessity. 5, what is public is a public good. 6, all bits are created equal. And 7, the internet shall be operated openly. Argue with me, change those, but let's have that discussion. Let's have principles to point to for this, our new world. Because if we do not, we leave it by default to the governments and corporations, not all of whom are evil, as Esther said, but who are inevitably acting in their own self-interest. We must act in ours. Thank you.
Great. Okay, our next speaker is Rebecca McKinnon, who came up from Washington, where she's a fellow at the New America Foundation and is writing a book that will come out next year called Consent of the Networked.
Thank you very much. I'll start off kind of with the private sector where Jeff left off and then move into some other points as well. So we do have this new situation, as you sort of outlined, where increasingly the public square is moving into the digital realm, which is increasingly sort of created, owned, and operated by private companies. And the problem is that, of course, private companies have their own terms of service and so on. They don't have to enforce the First Amendment in their spaces and can drop a user for any given reasons. And so how do we ensure that the public discourse, which is increasingly dependent on these privately operated spaces, still has a place to exist? And the Amazon case and also with PayPal and Visa are an instance where, you know, the government pressure wasn't actually all that direct. You know, in the PayPal case, and also in the PayPal case, it was just that they saw a opinion that had been written by as a lawyer in the State Department, and they said, okay, this means that this is troublesome speech, so rather than wait until the Supreme Court rules on it one way or the other, whether this was a crime, we're just going to dump this. With Amazon, it was Joe Lieberman expressing opinions and so on, and just deciding that this speech was too controversial for them to want to continue to deal with, and that therefore they were in their legal rights to drop WikiLeaks. When it comes to, so we have a problem basically where you've got private companies making decisions about speech that's controversial and dumping it, and which means that it's much harder for unpopular speech, controversial speech to have a space that can be widely heard. It was suggested that why don't we build a non-commercial darknet or alternatives? I work a lot with human rights activists in different parts of the world who have tried, you know, hosting their own sites, hosting their own email, running their own sort of open source platforms. The problem is it's very, very hard to keep that stuff up when you're under attack, especially by a government. And so actually what people who work in the space that sort of advise human rights activists what to do with technology over the past few years have been advising activists to use Gmail, have been advising activists to use Amazon because it's robust in defending against DDoS attacks and so on. And so this is the problem that you know, in order to be really robust, if you're under attack, it's hard not to be dependent on the private sector. So the question is, how do we really reach out to the private sector and say, look, it's in your interest as a citizen of society to ensure that you do not erode free expression and democracy, which you really depend on ultimately for your business and your innovation. And so actually, when it comes to principles, there is an effort called the Global Network Initiative, which, Jeff, you may be familiar with, which actually has principles for companies on free expression and privacy. Only 3 companies have actually signed on to this, Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft. No other American companies or any other companies in the world have had the guts to sign up to this and to work with a group of human rights activists, socially responsible investors, to really think through, okay, when an organization like Wikileaks turns out to be your customer, how do you ensure that you're acting in a way that is mindful of free expression and that you're not eroding the public sphere? That companies need to recognize that they have this responsibility, and sometimes the choices are difficult, but they need to work these things through and not just sort of deny that they have any responsibility. So it's an effort to work with companies to get them to be more accountable. In situations where you might have to come down on the line, you know, for instance, you know, there are differences of opinion whether it's right, for instance, for Facebook to keep up WikiLeaks but dump the anonymous retribution people, you know, and where do you draw the line on these kinds of things and what's responsible? It's sometimes very difficult, but the companies need to have a process that their users and customers understand and the public understands, and that there is a greater sense of accountability to the public interest in this process that they are using to govern speech on their sites. I'm going to move on because there's a couple other things I want to say that are slightly different. I think we need to be very careful as we go forward to try and make sure that things do not go badly. And there are a few things I'm worried about. One is that, you know, as we criticize our government for having overreacted, I think we need to keep in mind that our government is not monolithic. That, you know, Sarah Palin said one thing, Joe Lieberman said one thing, you know, the State Department legal advisor issued an opinion. You know, that there are different things going on within the government, that the people of the State Department, I know a lot of people who work there, they're traumatized, they feel victimized. Apparently they know more than we do about what hasn't come out yet, and they're really concerned about the effect that this leakage is going to have on human rights activists and other vulnerable people around the world, and they're concerned about this. You know, I say to them, the U.S. government needs to come out more strongly about the need to protect free expression, due process, and rule of law in all of this, that the world is not seeing the U.S. as reacting well. But at the same time, I think this cannot turn into an anti-government thing. This should be pro-accountability, but this should not be, you know, we want a Hobbesian state of nature here. You know, and the problem is that in government right now, there's a real fear amongst the people who actually would like openness, and the people who've been working very hard for transparency, for using the internet, to bring more freedom, that they are hearing from the guys with stripes on their lapels and stars on their jackets that, you see, this is all coming to no good. We really need to crack down. You know, the people in the defense and the security establishment may end up winning out in terms of, okay, you know, we need to engineer anonymity out of the internet. And also that regimes that are much, 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 much worse than our own are going to take advantage of this and are going to say, see, this is why governments need to control the internet, and kind of basically form alliances with people in democracies who also want more control of the internet. So we need to figure out strategically how you empower people within our own government who actually want to do the right thing.
Thank you. I'm sorry. My apologies. Our next speaker, Jay Rosen, teaches at NYU in the School of Journalism, writes a widely read blog, PressThink.org. And he's been writing a lot on the WikiLeaks story, too. Jay, go.
Thank you, Mika, for organizing this, and thanks to you for coming. Jeff said he was an internet triumphalist. I am not an internet triumphalist. I'm a guy trying to figure out what's happening in my world, and I'm not someone who thinks of Julian Assange or WikiLeaks as a heroic organization yet. I certainly don't think of them as the enemy either. I'm just trying to puzzle through what they are. I want to start by describing what I think WikiLeaks is, because I've had to do that for a lot of people over the last few months, and I'm going to begin by just saying what I think it is. First, and you can find the points that I'm going to make at my blog, PressThink.org. I've condensed them into 140-character tweets for your convenience. In my mind, WikiLeaks is the first stateless news organization, the world's first stateless news organization. And because it has arisen from the internet in a condition of statelessness, we don't know what rules to apply to it. And that creates a lot of anxiety, and people fill that anxiety with a lot of bad ideas because of the nature of it as a stateless news organization. We don't understand how do we have a check on that, how do we make that responsible. The second thing WikiLeaks is it's a promise, and I think it's the most useful way of thinking about it. It's a promise or a contract that is extended to sources, to people with documents, people with the goods. And the promise says, if you submit your documents to us via our secure net connection at wikileaks.org, we will encrypt them in such a way that the authorities won't be able to find out who you are, and we won't even know who you are. And after verifying that they are what you say they are, that is, if you tell us they're diplomatic cables, we have to find out if they are diplomatic cables. We will, after doing some research and preparation and due diligence, publish them to the world. WikiLeaks essentially is that promise. And it wouldn't work, as I'll say later, unless the sources bought that promise. It takes the world's first stateless news organization to show our news organization how statist they really are. And this, I think, has come out in many of the reactions to WikiLeaks from our journalists, with Joe Klein standing as a kind of symbol for the rest. Secondly, the sources, you know about voting with your feet. The sources are voting with their leaks. They're voting with their leaks, meaning if they trusted the newspapers more, they would do what sources have always done and go to the newspapers. So there is something about that promise. There's something about the offer that WikiLeaks extends to sources that is working, at least for some, because the organization has been flooded with stuff. They have more stuff than they can handle. In fact, their processing power hasn't kept up with the inflow of material from their sources, and they've had to shut down in order to handle what they have. So the sources are voting with their leaks. That they choose to go to WikiLeaks rather than newspapers tells us something about the newspapers. And I think what it is our watchdog press died. It died definitively under Bush, but even the illusion of it has died. That is, people don't see it as the check on power that it says it is. And it hasn't operated in such a way that it can be the check on power that it says it is. The massive increase in secrecy that we've seen in our government hasn't been matched by a massive increase in capacity in the watchdog press. So the watchdog press, as an idea that professional journalists will penetrate the secret world on our behalf and find out what's happening and come back and tell the world, that illusion died. And it's not possible to believe in it anymore. But what is possible is a kind of distributed eye on power that would include the old press. And that's what we're seeing emerging with WikiLeaks. Political scientists define the state as the entity that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. But nobody can have a monopoly on the legitimate use of digital force. That's impossible. And so this is one reason why we have to try and figure out how would we make WikiLeaks and organizations like it a legitimate actor in international affairs? How do we make it act legitimacy? What even do we expect? What are the terms of legitimacy for a stateless news organization acting with digital force, meaning forcing your secrets into the public realm? Everything a journalist learns that they cannot tell the public because they promised somebody they wouldn't, poisons that journalist's relationship with the public. And this is the problem with confidential sources as they have been used. Those poisons build up over time to such a degree that the watchdog press itself cannot operate. WikiLeaks, the way it's organized, actually avoids that because they tell you as much about the source as they know, and they don't separate their knowledge from your knowledge. And that's one of the reasons they're so compelling to sources, is there's no difference between what they know and what they tell the public. Our professional press doesn't realize how that has hurt them. Finally, if there's people wondering, what could we do about this situation? One small thing that would be really helpful is a series of videos placed on YouTube that explain terms of service in plain English, so that you actually know what you are signing up for when you go with Amazon, when you use PayPal, when you use MasterCard. And terms of service in plain English would begin to demystify the system that allowed private companies to shut off WikiLeaks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, we're going to now move further down the table and hear from Karn Ross, who runs an organization called Independent Diplomat. And for 15 years, he was a diplomat in the British Foreign Service. Karn.
Thanks, Micah. I should explain just a tiny bit more about me. I resigned from the British government over the Iraq War. I was Britain's so-called Iraq expert at the UN Security Council, dealing with weapons of mass destruction and sanctions for 4.5 years from 1997. Independent Diplomat is an organization that advises governments and in some cases liberation movements around the world on how diplomacy works. So I still very much work in the world of diplomacy. Several points to make. First, those who claim that the data in these cables are minor or not remarkable are very, very wrong. Rick Hertzberg made that claim this week in the New Yorker. Esther Dyson just suggested that too. The revelations are remarkable and in some cases game-changing. For instance, the revelation that the US is conducting aerial reconnaissance of Lebanon at the request of the Lebanese government is extraordinarily, potentially destabilizing for Lebanon right now. So don't claim that it's nothing particularly new. Other revelations, such as the point-blank refusal of Karzai to deal with corruption, or the discussion between General Petraeus and the Yemeni president of how to bomb targets in his own country. These are extraordinary revelations. Second, it's not yet proven that the cables have caused harm to US servicemen or officials or civilians, as the US government is claiming, but undoubtedly there is serious and major harm to US interests worldwide. It's absurd for WikiLeaks or frankly the New York Times to claim that the process of redaction that they've subjected these cables to somehow removes the possibility of harm. The world is not a chessboard, it is a complex system. You make a big change in one piece of the forest, this is going to ramify in many different ways across the forest, including far away, in ways that are good and bad, but above all, unpredictable. Third, governments are responding by locking their data tighter, but there's a fundamental paradox and contradiction in doing this, because governments need to share information. They can't operate by word of mouth. In order to be effective diplomatically, your diplomats have got to know what's going on. One of the reasons the good diplomatic services share everything that's sensitive amongst their operational staff. One of the reasons the UN is not effective is because nothing sensitive is shared within the UN Secretariat, because everything is leaked. So if governments to remain effective, they've got to share data amongst themselves, which means that they will remain vulnerable to WikiLeaks in the future. Fourthly, I'm surprised at those who claim that governments need secrecy in order to operate without knowing what it is that governments are keeping secret. I worked on very sensitive issues, including Afghanistan, Iraq, terrorism for many years, and far too much is kept secret. Secrecy does not promote good policy making. I worked a lot on Iraq, on sanctions on Iraq. This was a very bad policy that caused immense harm to the civilian population of Iraq. I've no doubt that if that policy had been conducted under greater public scrutiny, it would have been a better policy. The argument that congressional or parliamentary scrutiny are adequate checks and balances on our governments doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I have testified to Congress and to the British Parliament many times, but I testified only after I resigned, and only after my government knew about me. Sorry, after the Parliament knew about me. Before I resigned, when I worked on all of these issues, I was never scrutinised or questioned by parliamentarians or people in Congress, or frankly, to any adequate degree by journalists. Fifthly, this is perhaps one reason why WikiLeaks exists. Another is that, of course, people feel that government has not told them the truth, particularly over the last few years in the war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the rest of it. People are right to think that. I resigned from the British government because it lied about its reasons for going to war and had ignored available alternatives to war, which is a fundamental duty of government. If governments did not lie, then WikiLeaks would not be so potent. One hope of all of this is, of course, that governments will draw the conclusion that the permanent risk of being WikiLeaked means that they need to more closely align what they're doing in private with what they're saying in public. I don't think that's a necessarily certain result from all of this. One can only hope that it will be. If that is the result, then it is a positive benefit. My final point is that if WikiLeaks is to continue, as we can assume it will, other WikiLeaks are already emerging, we need to develop a new discourse of the responsibilities that WikiLeaks and other leakers must bear. It's clearly insufficient for them to say, governments lie, therefore everything we leak and everything we do is morally legitimate and correct. That is not an adequate response. If you have information, as WikiLeaks does, you have power. With power comes responsibility. That responsibility includes many things: to do no harm, for instance, which they've demonstrably not done in this case. But it also implies a responsibility to understand the data which you're demanding access to. It is entirely legitimate for the public to demand to know more of what governments are doing in the foreign policy realm. But with that demand must come a consciousness and an imperative to understand the data better. The world is a very complicated place. International relations is very complicated. And to demand access to it, you must also respect and try to understand that complexity. Thanks.
Not only is he a diplomat, but he got in under his 7 minutes. Thank you. Our next speaker, Douglas Rushkoff, a dear friend of PDF's, has written many books, has been working in the digital space
almost since its beginning. His new book is called Program or Be Programmed, 10 Commands for a Digital Age. Doug?
I kind of only want to say one thing, so I should be fast. The watchdog press that Jay's talking about was killed by the same forces that are preventing us from having the kind of internet that we imagine we have, but actually don't. And these are the forces of corporatism, fear, and complacency. A Google ad-sponsored citizen journalism will be no better than an ad-sponsored regular press. The question that I think we need to ask, and the question that this situation has made transparent, is: do we want a real internet? Do we want that? We don't have a real internet yet. We don't have the internet that we think we have, this sort of peer-to-peer, decentralized, uncontrollable, anarchist network. No, we have a highly top-down DNS, centrally controlled. They can flip you off as fast as you flick off a light switch. We don't want a rack on there, bop, they're gone. Right? Oh no, we can use domain name numbers, and oh yeah, right. I'm sure our iPads with their glass touchscreens are going to allow us to reconfigure our domain name servers, That's an easy one. Thanks, Steve. And the question of whether we want a real net is really the question about whether we want a real democracy, whether we feel we're ready for real democracy. Walter Lippmann and John Dewey had a nice, long, spirited debate in the early 1900s, where Lippmann basically said, no, the people are not ready. They're too stupid. They're uneducated. They can't run themselves. We need a benevolent elite to do this for them and create the illusion of democracy. Well, the net is a great illusion of democracy right now. It's a great illusion, but it is totally top-down controlled. It is completely centralized, to the point where the only way that real people found out about any of this stuff was through the New York Times and the Guardian anyway. Right? It's not that the net distributed this stuff. It's that the net allowed for the supposedly anonymous transfer of the data by a guy that we know, right? And where did he get it? And not to get conspiratorial, but I don't even believe, I don't know what to believe, right? I don't know what to believe. What is a leak? A leak means someone leaked something. It doesn't necessarily mean that the structure itself has a hole in it through which data is leaking. But most of the kids I talk to think this is the net because we have a great decentralized network. They don't understand the architecture of this thing. They think this is happening because the media has somehow wrestled control from the powers that be. It is not. It is not. The powers that be, so far, are allowing this amount of chaos to occur. And as surely as I'm sitting here, this event will be the argument used when net neutrality comes up on the floor of the Congress. Why we should give up control of this to corporations. Why the scale needs to be tipped back in favor of central authorities. An ad-driven for-profit net does not do the job that we're talking about here, right? It promotes top-down and centralized control through the accumulation of capital and all that. The public net did. And I believe that this situation makes visible the possibility for the kind of net that would actually be a peer-to-peer mesh network decentralized thing. That's possible. As far as I'm concerned, in the mid-'80s, FidoNet, which is where our computers all called each other late at night, and was closer to a decentralized network than this DNS net is. I just don't know that people are going to choose that. I don't know, and I can't argue for sure. My sense is that would be a better thing. It would be cool for us to have. But I'm not necessarily convinced that people should choose that, or that Lippmann was wrong, and that we're actually ready for that if we're going to be as irresponsible as we hear and let everything let all information want to be free because it really wants to, even when it doesn't. But I do think we are increasingly being made to make a choice. And it's not like we make a choice as a civilization and we vote. We make a choice every time we purchase technologies, every time we use things. We can either move further towards a net reality that is negotiated on our behalf, the sort of iPad reality, or we can move increasingly towards a net, right? A bottom-up connected, distributed, decentralized net. The latter would require us to understand how these tools work, what they are. It would require us to teach programming in school so that, not so everyone can run and follow Julian the way they followed Shay. It's so that people could actually be empowered to build a citizens' public network, because we are the only ones who could actually build such a thing. Next. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Doug. Our next speaker, Katrin Verklaas, for many years has run Mobile Active and still does. That's good to know, Katrin. And has a new organization, the New Rights Group, where she's one of the principals. Katrin.
Thanks. So I have 3 points to make. One is I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mika, but Apple is not sponsoring this event, even though it does look like it is. Second point, Jeff has proposed, and he didn't mention this in his talk, but it's on his blog, new, what's it called, Cyber Bill of Rights. I want to point out that there's been a long debate for the last 10 years at least in the run-up to the WSIS Tunis conference, the World Information Society Tunis conference in 2003, following that in 2006, a long and heated and very fruitful debate around what does an Internet Bill of Rights, a charter, an Internet charter look like. One of the key and lead organizations in that regard is the Association for Progressive Communications. So if we take this hinge moment and restart this conversation, as we tend to do every time there is a hinge moment, and there's been, I'm kind of too old for this, but there's been quite a number of them now, to please consider what has come before us and to build upon this. And I would urge us also, never waste a good crisis, to move this forward, because we have been debating this in international circles largely, not so much in the kind of network that maybe PDF is. What does that mean? How do human rights relate to internet rights or network rights? I work in mobile technology a lot. It's not the internet. Different kind of networks, different constraints. So can we please take into consideration what has come before us and build upon that rather than reinventing the wheel for the 50th time? So that said, let me make a third point, which is I have been grappling with this whole Wikileaks thing considerably, and I don't have really very good answers. What I did, being German and having a somewhat logical mind, wanted to do was dissect a little bit the different elements of the different dimensions, if you will, because I think there's a lot of conflation of different points and different aspects of this debate. So this is very preliminary and super drafty, so take it apart for all I care. So I think there's 5 sort of main areas where I think the debate and the discussion has centered around. One is the legal aspect of this. What is the First Amendment? What is freedom of speech? In a legal context, we have Supreme Court decision, United States against New York Times Company, that establishes the right of media institutions, however you define them, to publish information that has been leaked. What are property rights? Do companies that host organizations on their servers have property rights? What is, the internet, is the internet the press of the 21st century, as been mentioned earlier, within a legal context? So I think there's a number of legal considerations that we probably want to talk about with some constitutional scholars, people well-versed in international law and national and international law. There's an economic aspect of it. There's been some debate, and I don't know whether there's any actual data on this, on the recent DDoS attacks and the impact on business activity. What's the economic impact of this new world we live in when you can do what some consider the equivalent of a sit-in and shut somebody down on the web who conducts their business there. What is the role of corporate accountability as part of that economic equation, right? Do we need something like ombudspeople in corporations that actually have become de facto public spheres? Which leads to the next sort of dimension, which is huge, which is the political, well, let me actually say the ethical and moral and philosophical dimension of this debate, right? There is the role of privacy and secrecy, and you know, within government proceedings, within any organization, and you've spoken to that quite eloquently. There is what Rebecca was talking about, the corporation as a public sphere, and what does that mean from a moral and ethical and philosophical perspective. There's the role of the state in a networked world. There's the role of the press. There's the risks that human rights activists and others take by you know, going to this corporate cloud sphere and hosting our services there. Moving to the more political piece of this, what is the impact of WikiLeaks in particular in international relations? What is the impact on the State Department's freedom agenda, internet freedom agenda? And what is the, you know, political implication of all of this? I think personally it's been irreparably damaged, but it remains to be seen. Larger questions around internet rights that we've sort of touched upon a little bit. Should there be such a thing? How does this relate to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Is there such a thing on the internet? And then lastly, having 2 minutes left, the technology equation of this that you just spoke to. You know, FidoNet as a model for the internet that we've moved away from to, you know, maybe today a distributed DNS system, you know, peer-to-peer networking that certainly is very dear to my heart, working with human rights activists as well, kind of resilient technology that was mentioned earlier. Again, I think, you know, there's many, many sort of aspects to it, to the greatest extent that we can dissect these and actually become more specific and more proactive and less conflating. I think it would benefit the discussion.
Great. Okay, and before I bring up our last speaker who's batting cleanup, I just want to mention 2 things. First, if you're just joining us watching remotely, this is the live stream of the PDF Symposium on WikiLeaks and Internet Freedom. I've always wanted to say this, in the age of Big Brother, WikiLeaks is watching. They just retweeted the event. So we have more than 1,000 people already on the live stream, and I suppose more will come on as the day progresses. So welcome. We will try and follow your tweets and bring you into the conversation too as we move into open forum in a few minutes. Our next and last speaker for this first panel, Gideon Litchfield, comes from The Economist, where he is the deputy digital editor. Gideon.
Thank you. I was hoping that after listening to all of those people, I would know what I wanted to say and what I thought, and I'm afraid I still haven't really got a clue. So this is going to be a bit of a grab bag. These are birth pains. I think it's worth remembering that. Of course, it's terribly important, some of the decisions that are taken right now and the stances that we take, but with any upheaval, there are swings backward and forwards until things eventually settle down at some sort of equilibrium. And I think we're seeing some of that. I think that WikiLeaks overreached. For a good while, it was publishing things about corruption scandals in Peru and in Kenya and things like that. And certainly, intelligence agencies were concerned, but nobody who really, really mattered was upset enough to do something big about it. Then it went and published all this material that really gets at the interests of the US government, and this is the backlash. And as Mark Pesce suggested, there is a counter backlash because the way that the net community is responding, the way that WikiLeaks material is being distributed across many servers around the world, the counterattacks of Anonymous, I think that one can say that the authorities also have overreached, and there will be a backlash to that. So the question, I suppose, is to what extent is WikiLeaks achieving what it set out to achieve or keeping true to its principles? I want to say, just as a quick aside, I don't think it's helpful to call WikiLeaks a news organization. And I don't say that because I want to maintain my news organization's monopoly on the right to be called a news organization, but because WikiLeaks is just so different from every other media organization that exists in its structure, its infrastructure, its legal framework, its incentives, its motives, its constraints, its accountability. All of those are so different that calling it a news organization sets up expectations for us about how we should discuss it and what standards it should meet. And I think that just clouds the issue. So I prefer to refer to WikiLeaks as just a sui generis thing. It is what it does. And it should be held, it should be judged according to ethical standards of normal human ethics, and it should be evaluated according to the standards that it sets itself. So what are those? I want to just read a couple of things that Julian Assange said. From an interview he gave to The Economist a few months ago, he said, we believe prima facie that true information does good. True information can also cause harm, so we strip the harm from the information, then we release it. To which, of course, the obvious response was, well, how do you decide what actually is good and what is harm? And one of his responses was, well, we're accountable to the public and to our sources. And when I heard him say that, I didn't really believe him. I thought, you're not really accountable to anybody. But as I said, what we're seeing now in the backlash and counter-backlash is that he is accountable in a way, even if that accountability isn't going through good legal channels, and even if it's not really to the public, but he's being held accountable by dark forces, by governments and by corporations. Nonetheless, that backlash is the beginning of a kind of accountability. And I think the way that WikiLeaks has worked with the latest releases, with the diplomatic cables, where it's allowed the press to take the lead in deciding what to publish, what to cut out, is a very smart adaptation, because it's beginning to do what some people have been saying it should do, which is apply journalistic standards. It's allowing the press to apply those. And in doing so, I think it's beginning to protect itself. The other thing that Julian Assange wrote that I want to mention is something from his blog from a few years ago. He said, the more secretive or unjust an organization is, the more leaks induce fear and paranoia in its leadership and planning coterie. This must result in minimization of efficient internal communication mechanisms, an increase in cognitive secrecy tax, and consequent system-wide cognitive decline resulting in decreased ability to hold on to power as the environment demands adaptation. Hence, in a world where leaking is easy, secretive or unjust systems are non-linearly hit relative to open, just systems. Since unjust systems by their nature induce opponents and in many places barely have the upper hand, mass leaking leaves them exquisitely vulnerable to those who seek to replace them with more open forms of governance. Now, I just want to pick up one phrase in all of that, mass leaking. The kind of levels of leaking that would require even the repressive and unstable regimes around the world that WikiLeaks has sometimes been exposing to collapse or to seriously change their ways is a lot more leaking than has been going on up till now. And the kind of mass leaking that would seriously upset the US government or the systems and intelligence services of advanced, more or less democratic countries is on an order of magnitude that I think we can't even comprehend. And so the result, again, as I said at the beginning, that we're seeing is what Assange himself predicted, a minimization of efficient internal communications mechanisms. So we will probably see a reduction in the sharing of data within intelligence services, an increase in the cognitive secrecy tax, and in general, a clamp down in response to what WikiLeaks is doing. So I think that WikiLeaks has overreached because it has produced these responses, and it has, I think, done harm, and it has made misjudgments. But as I said, these are birth pains. And so a lot of the debate around here has been focused around the fact that people really want a black and white answer. Is WikiLeaks doing good or doing bad? And in some ways, I think WikiLeaks itself is a red herring. Because as various people have pointed out, this sort of process, this sort of leaking is happening. If it doesn't happen through WikiLeaks, or if WikiLeaks is closed down, other organizations will spring up that do it. They will be moderated. They will learn from WikiLeaks' failures. They will take different approaches. And they will probably be more cautious. That's it.
Great. Okay. So We're going to shift it now into more of an open forum, and Jeff Jarvis is going to play Oprah Donahue for us. But before he does that, I just want to take a second. First, let's thank our panel. Give everybody a round of applause. Second, I just want to mention that we have just posted the early announcement for PDF 2011, our 8th annual conference. It's going to be June 6th and June 7th here in New York at New York University. You can find out more information about the great lineup of speakers that we've already confirmed. People like Larry Lessig, Rebecca McKinnon, Jay Rosen, who are here on the panel, Dana Boyd, Cory Doctorow. The whole political spectrum is represented from one of the national leaders of the Tea Party Patriots to the political director for Move On. It's going to be a great event. For today only, you can register at our lowest price, $300. That's well below what we're going to be charging. Go to bit.ly/PDF2011 and follow the links there to go register. And please tell other folks, be a big help. Okay, Jeff.
All right, so I see the first hand already. So I'm going to try to play Oprah here or Phil Donahue. I don't have to get a wig for that. But I also want to be very, very cautious to make sure that we include the folks who are out there in the world because they outnumber us. So I've asked Jay Rosen to keep a watch on the hashtag space. If you see something great that you see passing by in the hashtag space, put up your hand with a finger so I know you're talking for the world rather than the room, all right? And obviously make it very quick. We don't have much time. Talk as fast as I do, and we'll get through something.
Good morning, I'm Allison Fine. I want to thank Micha and Andrew for making this possible today, and thank you, Jeff, as well. The State Department is a fortress organization. It is created with high walls and wide moats to keep insiders in and outsiders out. And these kinds of attacks from WikiLeaks just reinforces, as you said, Rebecca, the default setting by so many people to be more secretive and less transparent. I think it could be enormously helpful and constructive for us today if we could kick around some constructive suggestions for fortresses like the State Department of how we want them to behave specifically and how they can balance the need to be private in some cases and to be more public and transparent.
I should have added this. I see Dave Weiner over there who I think inspired me the first time for this kind of format, that there is no panel. Dave said to me, the room is the panel. So I want to emphasize we don't need to address things to the panel. The panel is welcome to join in as everyone else is now, but we've heard from the panel, so I think we want to hear from the room as well. Right? I saw someone who was here. Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to refer people. There's some wonderful, wonderful books by a man named Jonathan Israel about the history of Spinoza and the radical enlightenment in the late 1600s and the 1700s. And Spinoza was the most widely distributed author in almost all major European libraries, and all of his works were banned by the church. And they were generally spread by publishing outlets, which also put out a lot of pornography. It was the first time it was the first period of PDP, P2P, and governments had 120 years to react to it, and it's extremely instructive to learn how they did.
Thank you. All right, here, I'll get around the room if you're not.
Hi, on the point of Spinoza, everybody in this room should look up the term obscurantism because it is completely relevant to this. Chavanirad, about 30 years ago, I started working on the educational and social aspects of computer and internet use. For the last 20 years, I've been working on citizen engagement online, and about 15 years ago, I was operating the Eugene, Oregon Community Network, EFN.org, and we used to have police and various law enforcement come in the front door, and they'd sit there and say, we need the entire content of the mailing list for Earth First. And somebody at the front desk would say, let me get Shava, and I'd come out and say, good afternoon, sir. Can you give me your warrant? Can you give me your subpoena? And they sat there and said, nobody else ever asks us for that. Things haven't changed, and this is something that we need to think about because there is an extra legal aspect to most of the stuff that's gone down with restricting WikiLeaks, which is the equivalent of stopping somebody who looks like they have the wrong color of skin in the wrong neighborhood. And that happens online all the time. The other thing you have to say about this is that one of the things I've seen in the press, I used to be the executive director of the Tor project. And so I have a little bit of a background in hacker culture. But one of the things I've seen in the press is the most amazing misunderstandings of hacker culture. Hacker culture is not geek culture. Hacktivist culture is not hacker culture. And it behooves us to make a commitment on all sides of this discussion to understand each other's cultures so that we can move forward.
Thank you. Tristan.
So first of all, the interesting thing is the location here. And I'm going to remind people about 100 feet that way is where the British came in 1776 and invaded New York in an illegal fashion, basically prompted the rest of the country to declare independence. About 2 miles of that way is where the UN is located, where we're basically trying to keep peace internationally. Now, laws have been broken here, but interestingly enough, they haven't been broken by Wikileaks. I mean, if Wikileaks were the New York Times, it would have full protection of the law in the United States. The Supreme Court has declared it such. The Supreme Court has extended those rights to the internet with Reno versus United States in '97. Earlier this year, the State Department, which is at the center of this controversy, established a set of rules around internet freedom. Hillary Clinton herself said that governments should fully extend the right to freedom of expression and the right to freedom of information to online organizations. Yet today, they seem to have changed that position and are applying some level of pressure to different organizations around the globe to ensure that WikiLeaks cannot be heard. So the question is, what can be done from a legal standpoint? Talking to your Declaration of Rights, it's relatively simple. Really, there are two basic sets of rights. First is the right of non-conviction. Let's not forget here, WikiLeaks has not even been convicted of any crime. If you're not convicted of a crime, you should have the right to connection, and you should have the right to domain name. And that's relatively as simple as that. No one is allowed to cut that right off until you've been convicted. If you are convicted, then at that point you still have that right until you are fully, sorry, let me back up. Once you are convicted, there are certain rights that you lose. Today, a defendant that is not convicted but indicted for a crime loses the right to economic freedom. Their assets can be seized, payments to their accounts can be stopped. Under those kinds of conditions, the right to freedom of expression would be protected and any kind of criminal behavior would be prevented.
To the room, you're the camera, right? I'm not seeing questions come up, but we're watching. So, that's a finger. Good. No, that's not. Oh, that was the signal. There we have. So I want to talk to.
Yeah, so Privacy Camp, which is probably maintained by Sean Dakin, asks why the government pushed back now for state versus prior for the Department of Defense. It's a question that he's posing.
I didn't understand the question.
Well, I can ask him to, we can wait for him to direct message me or recommend it on the PDFLeaks channel, or I can go to some other points that were made earlier on the Twitter stream. Okay, Danielle Gould had a good one earlier, a good point to make, if I can find it. She asked, do we want a real internet was a question that one of the panelists posed earlier. Now, a highly top-down controlled net. The real question is, are we ready for a real democracy?
I'm Todd Gitlin. I'm troubled by the Manichaean tone of some of the comments. We heard from Gideon Litchfield, I believe, a quote from Assange to the effect that it's good for the world if states suffer cognitive breakdown. Is that really the case? Would somebody like to argue that proposition? Have we been suffering from an excess of cognitive clarity? in recent years? Have we, can we have a hyper-democracy without a polis? Is there a global polis? If not, who appointed Julian Assange to act in the name of it? Now, these are not rhetorical questions. These are real questions.
No.
But the real questions will not be answered with bumper sticker slogans.
You go back here first. Right back here. I need exercise.
Hi, Catherine Fitzpatrick, also known as Prokofy. Professor Rosen, I wanted to take exception with your thesis about the voting with their leaks. It seems to me that unlike the Pentagon Papers, which involved peers collaborating and consensually giving up their documents, WikiLeaks involves coercion, hacking, mass leaks, and as Todd has just mentioned, with the intent to hobble states, not really open them. So I think the nature of this revolution matters. So I'd like to hear a little bit more on that. And also, Jeff, strenuous objection to your Bill of Rights, which I would like to throw out completely because we already have those rights. We're already connected. We already have freedom of expression rights in the Universal Declaration. So we don't need them conferred.
But does the rest of the world?
Sure. That's why it's called the Universal Human Rights. It's not conferred by Google or by WikiLeaks, whoever they are.
Got it.
Okay, we
Somebody
have
wanted
a,
to
yes,
respond.
Esther would like to get in. Let's see if
Good.
we can get her in. I don't know.
To-
Are you there,
Okay.
Esther?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I wanted to go back to the previous question to some extent, and it's a really interesting thing. We keep talking about decentralization, which I know what that means. Democracy, I'm not sure we really want every citizen of the world voting and then everybody living by what the mass majority wants. So I'd be careful about talking about democracy. The point I wanted to make is we think WikiLeaks is this single phenomenon. In fact, somebody mentioned Spinoza. More recently, there was Johan Helsingius who had anon.tenet.fi. There are lots of sites that leak stuff. WikiLeaks, by having, number one, very good publicity, by having a business model of working with the press, for a lot of reasons, basically, they operated in a market of leakers and got a fairly important centralized position. So what's interesting here is, in fact, we are kind of voting and anointing WikiLeaks, to some extent legitimately, because they do a reasonably good job of vetting the authenticity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we need to expect is there are going to be fake WikiLeaks to the extent that WikiLeaks becomes more distributed in order to become more robust. We're going to have an interesting world. We need to look at that, figure out how we're going to deal with it, and understand that, ironically, we have centralized WikiLeaks. And what are we going to do in a world where we don't know which leakers to trust, where the stuff is not necessarily authenticated? That's a question.
Rebecca, you want to make a quick point, and then I'll come here?
Yeah, just listening to a lot of the comments, one thing that really strikes me is the extent to which our technical innovation has far outstripped our political innovation, and that we need to innovate politically, globally, to catch up, because we barely have the right vocabulary and frameworks to even think about this, and I think that's what the WikiLeaks situation really shows. And I'm also reminded in some of the comments, we're going back to the Federalist Papers, really, and the debates surrounding, to what extent do you want a pure Athenian democracy, and does that scale, versus do you need a more representative, and what's the point of governance in the first place? And do you want a Hobbesian state of nature, or do you want consent of the governed? And how do you achieve consent of the networked in this globally interconnected public sphere where different governments are representing people to greater or lesser degrees, and you have large private interests also playing powerful roles in how our discourse proceeds and how we can organize, and we just do not, we need to really leapfrog our kind of political discourse, and we need to have a global really debate, and not just amongst Americans in New York City, but But, you know, how do you ensure that vulnerable minorities don't get overrun and oppressed by tyrannies of the majority, which you would get in a pure digital democracy? And so we've got a lot of issues that we need to work through, and we are so far at the beginning of even figuring out how to start to work them through and how to even structure
the fundamental
a
question that was
discourse
raised
about
is
it.
the polis. Who is the public? What is the public? Is where we're going in this. We have a bunch of short-term questions, but if we're truly at a hinge moment, that's the hinge moment where we are. And then what do governments mean? What is their role? We don't know these things. That's the beginning of the question, yes.
And in order to get there, we have to get smarter, not dumber, right? And it feels like because we have the tools of self-expression, we all think that we have the ability to express, you know, but we don't, you know, and we don't have basic civics, government, polis type education in our elementary, junior high schools here. So there's a conversation we need to have that we don't even have the tools or cognition to have.
But I think that Rebecca's right too, that this is about far more than America. This is a starting point, but education and governments and societies and cultures all vary greatly. Yes.
So one thing that I haven't heard too much of, by the way, my name is Nonek, and some people in this room have called me a Bolshevik, and I find that funny. I'm also a subject of a WikiLeak. I am in one of the documents during the 2008 Olympic protests. I was deported from China, and I just find it funny that I have a WikiLeak about me. So, so one thing that in my role, yeah, you can buy them on the Students for a Free Tibet website. You can get them now for your holiday gift shopping. So one thing that, you know, I work for government, though I don't represent government in this particular capacity. Here I'm a citizen and a political activist, and am willing to throw my physical body into environments to protest the states that exist. So within the context of a digital democracy, how do I throw my physical self onto the train tracks or in front of the tanks? How do I show civil disobedience, legitimate civil disobedience in a digital democracy and not get called, you're a vandal, you're a Bolshevik, you're a terrorist? What's my answer? Well, to that question is DDoS is a legitimate form of civil disobedience. To be able to take down any type of actor, and if we have white hat hackers who work for governments and essentially are taking down other governments, then there are legitimate forms for organizations like Anonymous, 4chan to self-organize, self-congregate themselves, and to express their political opinion in ways that are stateless. So, but I want to hear more of that because, you know, we talk about news, we talk about government, but what about the people? Where's the power to the people to kind of self-organize and protest?
Harden, as I go around, you were going to say something?
The discussion's already resembling a stream of comments underneath the blog with nothing being answered. I want to address
That's otherwise known as life, yes.
Well, one can actually structure proper debate, and that's one of the problems with the internet, is that proper debate is not really structured, and that is one of the requirements of a polis, is one of the requirements of a proper democracy. But I want to address the question from the lady about the State Department. What can the State Department do to be more open? How should it respond to WikiLeaks? I wrote 70,000 words about this in a book called Independent Diplomat, Dispatches from an Unaccountable Elite, which kind of explains what I think about it. But I've got three very short suggestions. One is, obviously, it needs to release far more data. There needs to be a default of releasing data rather than not. The second is, of course, to do what you say, not to do something differently from what you say. And that, I think, has become particularly pertinent the last few years. The third is, you really want to make a release of WikiLeaks or analysis of American foreign policy as boring as talking about the administration of your local hospital, something that matters but is actually not very exciting, or say analysing Swedish foreign policy because the Swedes more or less do what they say. Their public rhetoric matches their private policy. That's why Sweden's quite boring to analyse in foreign policy terms. The fourth is a more general point about the polis, which we seem to be groping towards, about this question of what is democracy and how does democracy respond to WikiLeaks, to the virtual world. And I think we're just kind of casting around at the beginning of this debate. We don't have any coherent answers at the moment. All I would say is that there is an obligation to become more intelligent yourself about foreign policy if you are to demand WikiLeaks. When I was working on Iraq policy, one of the reasons we felt utterly immune to public pressure was because most of the public pressure and the vast majority of the media scrutiny was so fantastically ill-informed and stupid. The other final point, there is a question here about virtual versus real, material versus virtual. What is real political action? The China-Tibet activist asked this question, how can I throw myself on the tracks? My answer would be throw yourself on the tracks. Doing something in the virtual world does not equate to real material political effect. The comparison I draw is between the millions of people who sign internet petitions to see free Aung San Suu Kyi, which, well, actually in the last few weeks that has had some effect, but it's not the internet petitions that freed her, with the tens of thousands of people who volunteered to fight fascism in the 1930s. They took their own bodies and sometimes sacrificed their lives to stop something they detested. Internet activism doesn't do it for me.
We've got 15 minutes and tons of people, so please make your point, make it as quickly as possible, just to add into the discussion. We're not going to solve things today.
This is based upon what Doug said earlier about net neutrality, and my simple question is net neutrality as it's commonly understood possible even today?
Run in the back, patient men back here, and then we'll run all around.
Yeah, I would say well, it certainly doesn't exist today. You know, the net neutrality exists as a social construction now, not as an artifact of the technology, right? So we have net neutrality, but for something like it, because the people running the net are allowing us to have it. But we could, and it's not that hard, we could build a net that had net neutrality as sort of an intrinsic quality of its architecture.
Back here.
Yeah, I think today we've talked a lot about the distinction between private and secret, and I think it's just useful to add a third layer to that, which I think in all of our lives we engage in that usually, which is just the routinely confidential. So I think one of the reasons that WikiLeaks, I agree, overreached this time is because we all in our lives have conversations. Micha and Andrew decided who was going to be on this panel. Foundations talk about grantees, universities talk about hires. Those are not secret things. They are routinely confidential things. We all do those, and I think they have a strong place in a social fabric. We need those routinely confidential conversations sometimes to just run our lives. And so I think that living in a world where that kind of stuff would be routinely made public would be hellish, at least to me. And so I think one of the reasons we see this big backlash now is it's one thing to sort of come out and whistleblow a crime. It's different to disclose a bunch of routinely confidential stuff that people need to do their work. And just a distinction there.
Right. Well, people also have to change their perception of the net to realize that when they're typing anything into a keyboard, you are creating a record that lasts longer than the words etched on the side of the Parthenon. I mean, this is permanent. Or not.
Hi, I'm Jed. This is a great flash conference. In the transparency community in the U.S. and internationally, there's concern that the overreach in response to WikiLeaks will set back innovations that have been made and are being made, at this moment in transparency. And I'm wondering the same thing about innovation itself, like Rebecca's point. If we don't want to rebuild the wheel of having to re-explain to the technophobes and the transparentophobes and the leakophobes, why there's something good happening despite the challenges, despite the risks, how do we, this community, have a standing structure to demystify quickly?
Yeah, just very quick announcement. Apparently Anonymous is in the live chat because we have 1984 live viewers.
We have something from the live chat.
Yeah, so I was, in response to what you were saying, Nonek, on what are the new forms of civil disobedience, because I saw earlier that Anonymous was following the tweet as well. So I just wanted to read their new strategy that they put out. It says, so Anonymous is the sort of self-organized group that had been putting out these DDoS attacks. We have at best given them a black eye. The game has changed. When the game changes, so too must our strategies. Operation Leakspin. Begin searching through WikiLeaks, wikileaks.ch. Find only the best, least exposed links you can get your hands on. Post summaries of them along with the complete source. Encourage the reader to read more. Make a 1 to 2 minute YouTube videos reading the links. Use misleading tags, everything from Tea Party to Bieber. Post snippets of the links everywhere, or leaks everywhere, news comments, fan forums, etc. So that's another kind of civil disobedience.
And doesn't that smell like journalism, Gideon?
Yeah, guerrilla journalism.
Lots of hands up, Jeff.
I know. Go around as fast as I can.
Yeah, sorry for being contrarian. I'm Bob Wyman. I'd like to object. I think under no circumstances a distributed denial of service attack or any attack against the network ever a legitimate action. We all are concerned about the freedom to speech and crimes against the free speech. To attack the mere ability to speak, the capacity to speak itself, that to me seems to be the ultimate of crimes. I think we need to have an idea of crimes against the network, and a crime against the network should be considered an attack on every single one of us and be the worst of all possible crimes, no matter what justification.
Well said. I'm not supposed to express my opinion now, but well said.
Hi, my name is Mark. I want to follow up with the quote that Gideon mentioned earlier and then Todd you referenced. I think implicit in the Assange quote is the assumption that, at least certainly in the US, but most developed governments, that the government is often working and setting public policy in concert with interests that are not part of the electorate. So part of creating that secrecy tax is attacking the wealthy corporate interests as public policy is being set in a democracy and trying to get more of a true democracy back in place. I believe that is the point behind the Assange quote. So I don't think it's quite as black and white as you suggested.
Alex Howard, O'Reilly Media. Just to reflect what Bob said, I think that it's important just to reflect upon free speech in the Bill of Rights and what it means to have that reflected online. What Ethan Zuckerman's written recently about it being a commercial internet that our discourse is being hosted upon. The position that Twitter and Facebook now find themselves in being the main outlets for WikiLeaks to share information with the world that people can actually find. They're making very difficult choices. They're going to come under a lot of pressure from all sides in terms of keeping those outlets open. But when we choose to encourage or enable or empower people to shut down outlets of free speech online, you have to think very carefully about how we're actually reflecting the freedom of speech that I'm enjoying right now here in New York City to talk to all of you, whether we're then knocking that ability out for other people to share their thinking. I think the answer to free speech is more of it, not less.
And by the way, Alex, very good tweeting today. Thank you.
Hey, my name is Deanna Zant. I'm an author and technologist here in New York. I want to be clear, coming back to this discussion about what DDoS is and whether it's free speech or not. DDoS, for those who aren't clear about this, is not hacking. It is not destroying something. It is not causing permanent damage. It is a digital form of committing, similar to what you would do with a sit-in. You would temporarily disable the ability for someone to render their services and make their services available. That is a legitimate form of civil disobedience. So if we want to talk about free speech and the ability to voice our opinions online, and you'd look at what the corporations running the public spaces where we want to commit those acts of free speech and their ability to take that away immediately, how do we react to that? How do we take away their ability to stop us from doing what we will within our rights?
I will take the prerogative of the microphone to say that I think we, as Todd said, we're doing nothing less than going back to defining the poll list, which is a big task. So I would suggest that we look at this as kind of making an outline of points for debate for the future and discussion. And I think that that point is well made now, and I hope we have a great variety of ideas.
Hi, I'm Lisa Lynch, and I wanted to give Jay a chance to nuance his statement that the watchdog press had died, because I know that you don't mean that there's this kind of permanent and universal institution called the watchdog press, and it's a very historically specific phenomenon, and that it's very different in the United States than elsewhere. So I just wanted you to say a few more words about that.
Sure. What I mean is
The idea was that journalists would keep a watch on power, find out what is happening, if necessary, trade our right to know who their sources are for important information that we need to know anyway, penetrate the secret world on our behalf, like with the parking garage and the source in All the President's Men. And if it was really important, it would come out in time for us to make a difference. And what I'm saying when I say the watchdog press died is not that there aren't any journalists anymore who want to do that. There are, and occasionally it happens, as with James Risen and the leak about the government spying on us. But overall, that system does not work to protect us against power concealing its purpose and its deeds and doing things without us having any idea. And so we have to replace that system with a more distributed, public, stronger system, because we can't rely on the watchdog press to tell us what they're doing in time for us to make a difference. That's what I mean.
We're redefining the polis, we're redefining the press, which goes to Gideon's point too, that maybe we have a whole new system, new opportunities, new ways that are just different from the past. Yeah?
Thanks. I'm Bob Rosencrantz. I run Intelligence Squared Debates. I just wanted to be sure that people were aware that among the leaked documents here was a list of vital infrastructure targets around the world, things that Al-Qaeda could very profitably attack. These are many obscure things, many undefended kinds of things that you wouldn't ordinarily think of. But there is in the list of leaked documents a very exhaustive shopping list of targets that would be of enormous assistance to those who wish us the most grievous kind of harm. And I think when we think about that and that kind of material being out there, I think it has to inform the discussion and make it a little perhaps less abstract than some of the comments I've been hearing today.
Okay, I'm going to make enemies here. We don't have time for everybody.
3 minutes, Jeff.
3 minutes, Jesus. All right, I've been over here. So on geography, fairness of geography, I'm going over here.
I just want to point out to that last speaker that this point has been raised a lot, and it's a good one, but folks have been pointing out that what's in that leak in particular is available to around 3 million people who have security clearance to look at it. It's not top secret stuff, it's secret stuff. The distinction may not be obvious to everybody, but that makes it available to about 3 million people, and if it can't get out on its own through that, it's probably not all that valuable that it's being made out to be without the context.
Okay, I am actually going to take the moderator's prerogative and let Jeff rest his feet. Yeah, there are hands up, but the good news is we're going to have another hour of open forum after our next panel. I just want to let people know what's going on now. First of all, if you're watching on the live stream, and I know we have more than 2,000 people currently watching, wave to the internet. We're going to take a 15-minute break and come back at 12 o'clock with our second panel so that people can go to the bathroom, grab some coffee. You cannot bring food into this area, so I apologize because things are so tight. Take a moment if you want and tell your friends to watch the live stream. It's at personaldemocracy.com/PDFLeaks live. We'll be back in 15 minutes. You can also register for today only at the low, low price of $300. Go to bit.ly/PDF2011 if you want to come to our conference in June. Thank you. Thank the panel.
We're off to a great start.
Okay. If you're on the next panel, please come forward.